The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
It's not a coalition, it's not a merger, but this week the federal Liberals and the NDP made a deal. Tonight we'll examine what that meeting of the minds means for Canadians and our politics. Then our Ontario Hubs reviews serious problems in the Thundery Bay Police Service. And from cyber attacks and the war in Ukraine to the future of COVID-19 vaccines, we've got the Agenda's Week in Review. It's Friday, March 25th, and that's next on the agenda. If Canadians were annoyed about having a federal election last fall, a deal reached this week between the Liberals and the NDP means that they won't be going to the polls again for quite a while, about 2025 it seems. Still, it's a somewhat unusual development. With us on the significance and implications of such a pact, both in the nation's capital, Susan Delacourt, national columnist for the Toronto Star, and author and political columnist Paul Wells. Hi to you both.
Hi.
I think in journalism school, they should teach students to not go to sleep on Monday or Friday because that's when the news seems to drop. Paul, I wanted to start with you. What is the historical significance of this agreement between the Liberals and the NDP?
Well, I mean, it's highly unusual, especially at the federal level, and that's why a lot of people were taken by surprise. But there's plenty of precedent at the provincial level and in other parliamentary systems around the world, and it's entirely within the rules of Parliament. Basically, the main rule about who gets to form a government in a parliamentary system is who has the support of most MPs. When a party has a majority of the members of Parliament all in that party's caucus, then it's easy, right? You know, when Trudeau was Prime Minister after 2015, as long as all the Liberals stayed on his side, he had a majority. It's a little dicier in a context where no party controls a majority. And usually in our system, it's been sort of a game that goes vote by vote. The governing party looks for support from the Bloc or the Conservatives or the NDP, either willing support or they blackmail them with threats of an election. But it's happened in British Columbia from 2017 to 2020. It's happened in Ontario in the 80s, where two parties get together and say, look, we're just going to, the smaller party will promise not to vote to defeat the larger party. And for the duration of that agreement, or as long as both sides keep their word, then the government doesn't get defeated. We're going to spend the rest of this segment talking about the ramifications of that, but it's definitely allowed.
So help me understand this, Susan, because we've heard some politicians call this a coalition, but it isn't a coalition. It is an agreement. Can you help us understand the difference?
Yes. If you want to know how a coalition works, watch Borgen, the TV series. That's how, which is famously about a very unstable government that depends on cabinet positions. It's actual power sharing for the two parties. So if Justin Trudeau had been interested in a coalition, or Jagmeet Singh, they would have put a couple of MPs and the leader probably in a coalition. I don't believe we've ever seen that in Canada, maybe during the Second World War, but that is not what we're talking about here. It's not power sharing. And as Paul was saying, this is actually how government is supposed to work. We, in the media, I would say, or political observers, really like minority governments because there's an element of surprise to it. There's also an element of negotiation and democratic back and forth. And as far as I've seen and talked to people about this deal, that's what's going to happen. Is the NDP has not given an unconditional ticket to 2025 to Justin Trudeau. It's rounded out a deal by which they will be consulted more.
And not to plug TVO, but I think Borgen aired on this network at some point. But Paul, Susan said this is good for journalist types because it keeps us guessing on what's happening. But is it good for the Canadian people?
That's something the Canadian people will get a chance to pronounce on at the next election. Typically, these sorts of arrangements don't last beyond the next election, because it's like when two wrestlers are in a clutch, and then something's got to give. So in the most recent example, and really quite a good example of this sort of arrangement, the tiny Green Party caucus supported Premier Horgan, the NDP Premier of British Columbia, until the next election. And it worked so well that Horgan's NDP went on to a majority and didn't need anyone's support, and the Green Party kind of fell off the map. You often see things like that. That's an example of the voters deciding what they think of all of this. I'll tell you, from having spoken to them, that a lot of conservative, I haven't spoken to all of them, I've spoken to a few of them, a lot of conservative voters feel like this really delegitimizes their party's participation in the national debate. Conservative Party won the popular vote in the last two elections in a row. There were more people voting for Conservatives than voting for Liberals. And now they've essentially put a little ring fence around the Conservative caucus. They're going to govern without them. As I say, that's absolutely within the rules, but it smarts.
Well, let's go over the agreement, and we're going to come back to the Conservatives in a little bit, but I wanted to show some of the highlights of the agreement, what the Liberals and the NDP promise: a new dental care program for low-income Canadians, implementing a home buyer's bill of rights, developing a plan to phase out public financing of the fossil fuel sector, prohibit the use of scabs, that word is horrible, but replacement workers, in a unionized, federally regulated industry during a lockout or strike, and an expanded election day of 3 days of voting. Paul, what do you think of these promises?
A lot of that is current federal policy, longstanding federal policy. Using replacement workers in the federally regulated workplace is pretty strongly frowned upon by the current government already. And a lot of other, green retrofits and things like that are you're twisting Justin Trudeau's rubber arm. This is stuff that he already wanted to do and planned to do. Some aspects of it, dental care, pharmacare, is stuff that they had maybe talked about or commissioned studies of, but hadn't really made substantial progress. And now they'll face additional pressure, not a requirement, but additional pressure. They have to keep the NDP happy. And so that's going to increase the pressure on them to deliver on these essentially social policy fronts.
And Susan, one of the promises is a home buyer's bill of rights. We know in this country, housing is becoming so expensive every day. It seems as if the prices go up. If you're waiting, if you're trying to get on the ladder and you see this, you might get your hopes up. But how likely are any of these promises to be implemented?
I think there's a reasonable chance they will be. I can tell you what the New Democrats are worried about is this is a government that doesn't do things very nimbly, except for the initial pandemic response. But I think there is some worry that they will get to a point where, we need a little more time to do this. We can't do it possibly right now. And that is very that is on brand, as they say, for this government. I'm told that what happened here behind the scenes is that Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh had a meeting of minds on this idea that the progressive ideas they have don't just happen in one budget. They happen in 2, 3, 4 budgets. If Justin Trudeau wants to leave a progressive mark on the country, and he says he does, then he needs a few budgets to do it. The things that the New Democrats want to achieve have similar timelines. So from their point of view, it made sense to make a long-term agreement, and rather than doing a budget that pleases the NDP in 2022 and one that pleases the Bloc in 2023, one that they could get through over multiple years. That's my long way of answering the question that apart from dental care, which is people will feel the effects of that in it's being phased in. It starts with children in families earning under $90,000, I think, in the first year, and then it expands and expands to full dental care, but means tested dental care. But that's probably the most concrete thing people will see right away. But there are not going to be rainbows and unicorns in the sky because of this deal. It's a methodical, process-oriented, phased-in agreement.
And Paul, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh has been asked what they would get, and he said, at any moment, if we don't get, we have this in writing, if we don't get what we want, we'll walk away. In your view, who benefits more from this deal, the Liberals or the NDP?
The Liberals benefit more. Justin Trudeau gets to keep being the Prime Minister, and if he wants to, he gets a little calm period during which he could end his leadership, and the party could find a replacement. I have no idea. The NDP benefits a fair bit. The New Democrats I've spoken to are very pleased with this. Jagmeet Singh benefits too.
In what way?
He legitimizes his leadership of a party which he has conspicuously failed to deliver for in 2 election campaigns in a row. The NDP got rid of Tom Mulcair on the floor of their convention in Edmonton 2017 because they didn't like working with him, and because he had lost many of the gains that Jack Layton had won. In 2 elections in a row, Jagmeet Singh has not come anywhere close to the success that Tom Mulcair enjoyed. And at some point, New Democrats are going to notice that. But now they're in the middle of this deal with the Liberals that guarantees, 3 years of progressive government. And you'd have to be a particularly self-defeating kind of New Democrat to want to blow that up just because you've got a grudge against Jagmeet Singh. There's every chance that that was part of Mr. Singh's thinking as he negotiated this deal.
It's kind of hard to forget during the election the strong words that Mr. Singh had for the Prime Minister. Oh, to be a fly on the wall in these conversations. Susan, how do you think the NDP voters are receiving this?
I'm really glad you brought that up. I've been working on a weekend piece about this too, and I think really close political watchers will remember that right after the election, there was some talk that there was going to be some kind of an agreement, and 2 things happened. Word leaked out of it. I don't think it was as formal as what we've seen now, but also I'm told that on Trudeau's side, at least, feelings were pretty raw. The Prime Minister did a year-end interview with me at the end of in December 2021, in which he didn't want to talk about all those protests that had dogged him. He was obsessed with what he called the casual cynicism of the left and the attacks he'd received from progressives for not the accusation that he'd done nothing. So I think what happened was tempers needed to cool down. The Justin Trudeau is a little bit got quite a big thick skin actually, but the election did run to extreme talk on both sides, and I think that that needed to chill down. I'm told they get along. Jagmeet Singh and Trudeau now get along like a house on fire. It started when the Prime Minister called Jagmeet Singh to congratulate him on the birth of his daughter at the beginning of January, and the two have been having meetings virtually mostly for the last 2 months, and they've formed an agreement and trust. Too.
And I want to bring, Paul, back your comment about the Conservatives, because I keep thinking that Susan mentioned this close relationship that's developed between Mr. Singh and Justin Trudeau. If you're a Conservative voter, maybe you're feeling as if your party's being left out of the conversation. Do you think that maybe this was a missed opportunity by the Conservatives to maybe have a similar agreement with the NDP? Or do you think that it was a missed opportunity on both Mr. Singh and Mr. Trudeau's part in not having a broader conversation with the Conservatives? If this is about working together as a country.
So in a strange way, I think all of our politics, essentially since, at least since Donald Trump became the president of the United States, has been about the Conservative Party of Canada. And the questions have been, among those people among that majority who don't support the Conservative Party of Canada, is it becoming Trump-like? To the extent it's becoming Trump-like, can it be blocked, stopped, contained? So what do I mean? During the Wet'suwet'en-inspired protests over the Coastal GasLink pipeline at the beginning of 2020, that shut down rail service across the country and threatened the food supply in the country. Andrew Scheer, then still the Conservative leader, got up in the House of Commons and said, a lot of this activity that's causing these protests is criminal activity. The people who are responsible have to be caught, arrested, prosecuted. Harsh language, but a language about the application of the rule of law. The Prime Minister immediately met with all the other opposition leaders except Andrew Scheer, and on the basis that a language of punishment and reprimand was not appropriate because these were largely Indigenous protesters, and the Conservative Party was not a legitimate participant in the Canadian political debate for having made that suggestion. Much of what's happened since then flows from that moment, it seems to me. And so did the Conservatives miss an opportunity? The Conservatives are considered by many of the other members in the House of Commons not to be legitimate participants in our political debate.
What does that mean, though, for voters, for Conservative voters?
It means a lot of them are increasingly frustrated. A lot of them agree. Ken Bosenkool who's an Alberta Conservative who worked loyally at senior levels for Stephen Harper when Harper was Prime Minister and before, has a piece in the newsletter The Line this morning in which he says, look, we got to read the room. The right wing of the Conservative Party, to which arguably Ken Bosenkool belongs, is not getting accepted into the debate and into the it's getting stuff handed to it like this deal between Singh and Trudeau. So therefore, the Conservative Party's got to change and adjust. And Bosenkool is essentially, without naming names, arguing that the Conservative Party needs to pick a leader like Jean Charest, much more of a 80s progressive conservative style leader. That's hardly a unanimous opinion in the party, but it's striking that it comes from people like Ken Bosenkool.
Well, Susan, Prime Minister Trudeau said that this was about bringing stability to the country because of everything that we've been through in the past 2 years and everything that's going on right now on a global scale. Who will be giving credit if the government does implement these promises?
Well, I think probably the Prime Minister will get some bonus from this. Paul raises a really good point. You cannot ignore the Trump factor in all of this. That was the Prime Minister's first real jolt that when he had a majority. And some of the things you see in this deal are about turning Canada away from that Trump world. Don't forget the electoral reform thing, making voting easier, for example. In the United States, you see Republicans trying to make voting harder. That is a deliberate nod to what's going on down below the border there. Also, I think that you see that the Prime Minister is leaving himself, sort of, as Paul mentioned, an opening to leave. I don't think he's ever going to say when he's leaving. No Prime Minister announces 3 years in advance when they're leaving. But he has given himself a chance to do this. Let's not forget in Ontario, that's where this audience is, there was an accord between the Liberals and New Democrats, and initially that worked out best for the Liberals. David Peterson turned that into a majority. But Bob Rae turned that into an NDP government in 1990. So, that may be on the minds of people here too. Again, as I said in response to a previous question, you cannot judge this thing in the short term. It's going to be a long-term thing.
And Paul, in your column, you noted that 5 of the last 7 Canadian federal elections have returned minority governments. So it seems to be something that Canadians want. Does this deal give away any leverage the NDP might have to challenge the Liberals moving forward?
Mr. Singh claims not, and as a matter of fact, these things are honor. It's like an honor bar in a hotel room. Like you take the drink, you leave the money. It's up to you to keep your word. So Premier Horgan dumped his coalition or his supply and confidence partner cold a year short of the extent of that deal in British Columbia. He broke the terms of a public agreement with the Green Party. Voters rewarded him. These things are not cast in stone. And even to the extent they're written down, like balanced budget rules or fixed election date laws, they can be ignored with near total impunity. So if Jagmeet Singh decides that some element of his support for the Liberals is simply too hot for him politically, or if he just changes his mind, then this deal is done. And the same for Justin Trudeau. Marc Garneau was his foreign minister until he wasn't his foreign minister, and that's too bad, so sad, you know?
As we noted, this was a surprise. It took everybody by surprise. And I'm wondering, Susan, do we get a sense if there's a consensus in the Liberal and NDP caucus about this arrangement?
We're not going to hear that publicly, but, you know, I think there is some concern about the secrecy, and the Trudeau has a very tight circle, and Liberal MPs are already a little annoyed about that. It's a very, very tight circle. There were a lot of people who had no idea this was going on. New Democrats as well were kept in the dark deliberately. I think that's going to be the internal matter to settle. I think Liberals who are worried about the threat from the Conservatives, the blue Liberals, will be worried about not only the cost of this, but what their voters are thinking. I think a lot of Liberals are getting messages from their constituents saying, hey, I didn't vote for you because you leaned to the NDP. I voted for you because I'm a traditional Liberal who likes the Paul Martin kind of Liberal, you know, the budget balanced Liberals. So I don't know that it's enough to upset the deal, but I wouldn't say there's any unanimity yet.
And Paul, you said that you mentioned that the Prime Minister is not going to make an announcement that I'm leaving the party. Do you see Jagmeet Singh staying on as leader post 2025?
These are both relatively young men. They're younger than me, so I think they're just incredibly young. And they can. Trudeau himself is still 9 years younger than Jean Chrétien was the day that Chrétien was first elected prime minister. And so there's all the room in the world for these folks to decide that things are going well. In Jagmeet Singh's case, it's because expectations, New Democrats' expectations for their own party have, I think, properly been ratcheted way down from the short period of euphoria after 2011 when they thought winning 103 seats was normal. Trudeau, I want to call it discipline. The voluntary allegiance within the Liberal caucus and the broader Liberal Party for what Justin Trudeau does is beyond compare to anything I've seen in the recent factionalized history of the Liberal Party of Canada. Justin Trudeau is uncontested within the Liberal Party of Canada and will be, as far as I'm concerned, for the foreseeable future. And so if he likes the view, he's going to stick around. And if he feels like he's done enough, or if he's, you know, if voters get the final word, and if he's not sure he likes how that's shaping up, then he'll leave. And on the day he leaves, he'll get nothing but plaudits from his party.
And Susan, the Conservative Party has been going through a lot of changes, and there was a lot of excitement coming up for September because that's when they would choose their next federal leader. Do you think this impacts that at all?
Yes, very much.
In what ways?
First of all, Paul alluded to Ken Bosanquil's column, and I think that is an important thing, that the Conservatives are taking a harder look at the center right now because there will be Liberals, blue Liberals, to get from this. Also, whoever is named leader on September 10th has a lot more time to that gets rid of the urgency to elect somebody who's already in the House. It gives somebody time to build a team. So look to, you know, a big federal team. So that's an interesting new development too. I think it has changed, maybe not fundamentally, but certainly set the Conservatives on a different kind of timeline.
And Paul?
I'm struck by when Angela Merkel was the Chancellor of Germany, the slogan for her party, which is traditionally a conservative party, was Die Mitte. It means the middle. She used to walk onto stages at conventions and there'd be a great big sign behind her saying the middle. That middle is now orphaned in Canadian politics. There's room for an entire political party stretching from John Manley and Anne McClellan on the managerial Liberal left to the inheritors of Jim Prentice and James Moore on the managerial Conservative right. Most of those people don't feel like Justin Trudeau's Liberals or anyone's Conservatives really speak to them. Now, don't cry for them. Country doesn't need essentially Bay Street people to be happy for government to work. But it's a striking development, and politics doesn't long tolerate a vacuum.
And Susan, I'll give you the last minute. Another election is on the horizon here in Ontario. Do you see a scenario where the Ontario Liberals and the NDP form a coalition? Or an agreement.
Whatever.
Whatever.
Yeah. My colleague at Queen's Park, Martin Radcon, has done some work on this. I don't see it happening while an election is looming. They'll be watching it carefully. It does change things in Ontario too, I believe. But I don't think I don't think you're going to see Stephen Del Duca and Andrea Horwath out campaigning together for a coalition, an alliance, an accord during this campaign. I think that's off the table right now. You
said it does change things in Ontario. What did you mean by that?
Just because of what Paul was talking about too, the centre. The centre is an interesting place, and Ontario thinks of itself as the centre too. It is. I can say as an Ontarian, and I think that as long as we're having a conversation about where that centre exists, Ontario is. That's what I'm going to be watching during the campaign for sure. Is where is that big centre going?
Paul and Susan, it's been a thrill for me to chat with you because I'm a big fan of both of you. Thank you so much for your insights. I know you're very, very busy, and hopefully you can catch a nap on the weekend. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
The Thundery Bay Police Service has faced serious allegations of misconduct, shoddy work, and racism for several years now. It culminated recently with a damning new report and calls to simply dismantle the force. Charnel Anderson covers the Northwestern Ontario Hubs, and she joins us now from Thundery Bay for a more detailed look. Hello, Charnel.
Hi, Jan.
All right, I want to read a short little quote from you, and I'm hoping that you can put some context to it. This was from the former Thundery Bay Police Service Board Chair, and she wrote, "The Thundery Bay Police Service is on the brink of collapse." What do they mean by that?
It's a powerful statement, isn't it? I think that Georgianne Morrisseau used those words to really get people's attention drawn to the issues facing the Thundery Bay Police Service and its board. So Morrisseau wrote that in a statement that was published on social media earlier this year, where she also accuses current leadership of not being serious about change. And Morrisseau expanded on issues that she said she's seen during her time as chair of the board and then later as a member. And these are issues that she says are in the public interest, including that instead of allocating funds appropriately, leadership of the Thundery Bay Police Service has spent an exorbitant amount on funding improper investigations, though she doesn't say what those investigations are specifically. And her letter also mentions shockingly low morale among members of the service. She mentions a series of human rights complaints, including her own, that have been filed against the Thundery Bay Police Service, its legal counsel, and the board. And there's information to support much of what she's saying, particularly about the human rights complaints. I believe to date there's been a dozen or more human rights complaints filed against the Thundery Bay Police Service. And in terms of low morale among officers, a 2021 survey from the Thundery Bay Police Association, which represents sworn officers and civilian employees, found that 76% of respondents describe employee morale as negative or very negative. And so, I think that either one of these issues is a huge problem, but these issues combined with other issues facing the Thundery Bay Police Service and its board, I think that's why Morrisseau said that she feels the Thundery Bay Police Service is on the brink of collapse.
Yeah, just as you mentioned, you say issues plural, and of course these date back to pretty much 2015. And so for TVO.org, you wrote an article detailing sort of the events there. And it all seemed to have started with the death of Stacey DeBungy. Can you sort of tell us what happened in that particular case and how that sort of turned into what we're at right now?
Yeah, I will say that a lot of these issues date back even further, but I decided to start with Stacey DeBungy's death because his death and the initial police investigation into his death really was a pivotal moment for the Thunder Bay Police Service. And, you know, it continues to cast a shadow over the police service to this day. So Stacey, you may remember, was an Indigenous man from Rainy River First Nation who was found dead in the McIntyre River the morning of October 19th, 2015. Only 3 hours after his body was found and before he was identified, you know, let alone having the time to conduct a postmortem, the Thunder Bay Police Service issued a press release that said their initial investigation does not indicate a suspicious death. And then the next day, the police issued another press release that said his death was non-criminal. But, you know, because of how quickly the police determined Stacey's death to be non-criminal, it raised questions about the police investigation, and it raised concerns from Stacey's family, the community, Rainy River First Nation, and those concerns led to a complaint with the province's police watchdog, the Office of the Independent Police Review Director, which ultimately launched a systemic review of the Thundery Bay Police Service.
Let's talk about that review. Of course, it was Stacey's family and the then chief of Rainy River First Nation that brought that complaint forward to the Ontario Independent Police Review Directorate. Tell me about that systemic review of the Thunder Bay Police report. You know, there was, of course, recommendations, but there was a lot of years and a lot of steps before that as well.
Yeah, so about a year after Stacey's death in 2016, then OIPRD Director Jerry McNeely launched this review. And the terms of reference for his investigation were, among other things, to examine the policies, practices, and attitudes of the Thunder Bay Police Service, specifically related to Indigenous missing persons and death investigations. And he also wanted to look at whether these investigations were done in discriminatory ways. And at the same time, the OIPRD started looking into the issues around the investigation of Stacey DeBungy's death. And what they found in that case was that the police failed to act on investigative leads. They failed to follow up with witnesses. And the OIPRD went so far as to say that the deficiencies in the investigation were so substantial and deviated so significantly from what was required that there were reasonable and probable grounds to support an allegation of neglect of duty. And as a result of this report, the officers involved in the investigation of Stacey DeBungy's death are facing neglect of duty charges under the Police Services Act. In terms of the systemic review, though, that concluded in December 2018 and resulted in the Broken Trust Report, which you may remember is quite a damning report. And it found that there was something of a pattern in the way that the Thunder Bay Police Service conducted sudden death and homicide investigations, because many of the investigations that the OIPRD looked at, which they looked at random, had serious deficiencies. And so all this work, these investigations resulted in 44 recommendations, many involving the Thunder Bay Police, including a recommendation to reinvestigate 9 sudden deaths and other recommendations that are kind of intended to restore trust between police and the Indigenous community in Thunder Bay.
You mentioned the 44 recommendations. You also mentioned report after report after report. And I think at the end of the day, people want to see what progress is being made. Do we have any progress on those 44 recommendations?
Yeah, so, I mean, the bulk of the recommendations were for the Thunder Bay Police Service, and some of the recommendations, like reinvestigating 9 sudden deaths, were a lot more involved than other recommendations, like including name tags on uniforms or implementing body-worn and in-car cameras. But they have been at this for a few years now. And earlier this year, the Thundery Bay Police Service said that they were on track to complete 80% of the OIPRD's 44 recommendations. So they said that 20 of these recommendations were complete, while 4 were not applicable to them. And then the remaining 12 recommendations, which include things like implementing Indigenous cultural competency training, information sharing, and improvements to file management, among other things, are ongoing.
In our last minute together, I want to talk about sort of the latest developments. Of course, we talk about, the police service being on the brink of collapse, calls for dismantling the force entirely and having the OPP in there. Can you tell us about sort of those calls and some of the other latest developments?
Yeah, sure. So the report on the 9 reinvestigations that was recently leaked to media, and that found shortcomings in the original investigations. And that same report also recommends reinvestigations or a coroner's review of 16 more sudden deaths. There was a second report that recommends a review of 25 unsolved cases of missing murdered Indigenous women and girls. And, besides those reinvestigations, there appear to be a number of internal issues facing the Thunder Bay Police Service, including the complaints filed with the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, the fact that the deputy chief was suspended in late January. There's an OCPC investigation that's been launched and an OPP investigation that's been launched. So I think we're really eager to kind of see where these investigations go.
Charnel Anderson, thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight. Of course, a story that you will keep your eye on and keep us updated on. Thank you again.
Thanks.
The agenda this week explored new vaccine technology aimed at keeping COVID-19 in check and remembered the first Black politician elected to a legislature in Canada, Ontario's Leonard Braithwaite. The agenda's Week in Review begins with the war in Ukraine and assessing the role of cyber attacks in the conflict.
A headline in Politico said, "A Russian invasion of Ukraine could redefine cyber warfare." Former White House cyber expert Jason Healy said that it will be the first time a state with real capabilities is willing to take risks and put it all on the line. A report from the RAND Corporation warned of the, quote, massive employment of cyber warfare tools to create shock and awe, causing Ukraine's defenses or will to fight to collapse. Let's explore that. Jacqueline, to what extent have any of those things happened?
So none of those things have happened. And I think if you look back at the work that Brandon Valeriano and I and many other scholars within academia have been doing, we actually didn't anticipate that cyber would look like a bomb or that cyber would decrease the will of the Ukrainians to fight. In fact, a lot of the academic research conducted over the last 3 to 5 years suggested that the cyber war would play out exactly how it has played out so far.
Brandon, are we learning that cyber operations actually, apparently, are not all that useful when it comes to the battlefield?
Well, yeah, that's something we've thought for quite a bit of time, that they're not really coercive, they're not really useful on the battlefield, that this idea of decisive victory through cyber never really was true, logically, empirically, historically.
Christian, why do you think? Tell us your view on why you think things have been so quiet on the cyber front.
Yeah, well, it's either the dog that didn't bark or the dog that hasn't barked yet. And so I think there may be also an issue of perhaps the Russians sort of keeping their powder dry. It may be that perhaps we're better prepared than we thought we were. It may be that the Russians just simply aren't as capable as we thought. We may be doing a very good job at suppressing certain of their capabilities. So, for instance, there appears to have been some impact on ransomware by some of these state-tolerated dark actors in Russia. So it seems that there is a significant amount of activity, and so I think it's difficult to tell from the open source evidence how much of this is attributable to what particular types of causes. But I do think perhaps the Russian operatives were caught as unprepared as their kinetic counterparts in having to operationalize a cyber campaign. And so they just perhaps didn't just have the time to actually pre-position themselves and shift from espionage capabilities to subversion or sabotage capabilities at the scale at which would have been necessary on this very short timeline.
Jacqueline, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, if you don't mind, if I could throw in a little bit of a caveat, because while we didn't see cyber operations looking like a bomb or looking like an aircraft, I think we are seeing cyber operations play out in an important way on the battlefield. There are reports of hacking into satellite networks that may potentially have had a large impact on Ukrainian abilities to command and control their forces at the beginning of this conflict. And I think as this conflict goes on, we're going to get a better understanding of how the Russians have tried to use cyber more like an intelligence tool or as a sabotage tool to try and create fog, to try and create uncertainty, and decrease the ability to command and control. And I think when we look back in the future at puzzles around this conflict, why the Russians have had such a difficulty controlling and commanding their own forces, why they seem to be always talking on unclassified networks, I think we're going to find that there is a much larger role for cyber operations, but it's going to look a lot more like intelligence and a lot less like bombs. And I think that's the overarching lesson that states should take from this conflict.
Janice, as Angela has said, Russia thought this war was going to be over pretty quickly, and it's pretty obvious it's not going to be over pretty quickly. Was there, as you look back at the past month, was there an apparent turning point in which everybody came to realize, oh my goodness, this is not going to take 72 hours, this is going to take a lot longer?
I think there certainly was, and it was probably the easiest way to convey that was that infamous convoy that rolled down the highways toward Kiev, and then it was stalled and stalled and stalled. There's an old military expression, Steve, logistics eat strategy every day for lunch. And that is a big part of what is bedeviling the Russians. Their logistics are terrible, is the only way to describe this. But when we talk about a stalemate, which I think is accurate, but only up to a point, let's just remember there is asymmetrical damage being inflicted here. Yes, Russians are losing soldiers, anywhere up to 7,000, which is, just an unbelievably high number for a month. It's important to recognize this. But Ukrainian cities are being devastated. It's not only Mariupol, it's many of them. And Russia retains the capacity to bomb and to use cruise missiles and to use artillery fire. That does not take away from how bravely the Ukrainians are fighting, but we have to be careful. There is a limited capacity. Any society has that to sustain this kind of horrific damage on its civilian infrastructure. So stalemate doesn't quite capture these asymmetrical dynamics.
Understood. Angela, it seemed clear that the original attempt by Vladimir Putin was to have regime change in Kiev and essentially demilitarize Ukraine. Neither of those things has happened yet. Do you think that's still the plan for Russia?
Before I get into that, let me just say the Russian population supports this war because they don't really know what's going on, particularly if they just have access to state-run media. They're told that this is a special military operation to denazify Ukraine and that Ukraine and NATO were threatening Russia with invasion. If they knew more about what was really happening, I'm not quite sure that the support would be that great. And just to reiterate again, a lot of the body bags are not coming back because they're not sending them back to Russia. They're keeping them in Belarus, and there are reports of that, about that today. So I think on the regime change, Putin has more or less given up on that. I think they've realized that, Zelensky is popular, that if they do want to negotiate with anyone, and maybe we'll come onto that later, Zelensky is the person they're going to have to negotiate with. Apparently, in the beginning, they did try to put someone else in power, and then they realized it was impossible, and that if they were to have a puppet government, they would have to occupy Ukraine going forward, because the minute Russian troops withdraw, then that puppet government would fall. And my colleagues who are experts on these military matters say it would take about 800,000 Russian troops to occupy Ukraine, for a long time, and they just don't have the resources to do that. The demilitarization, I think they also realize is going to be more difficult. I mean, they have knocked out quite a lot of Ukraine's own military equipment, and obviously Ukrainian soldiers have died too. But because the West is supplying Ukraine and will continue to do so, it would be difficult to do that. So their aims, I think, have become somewhat more realistic as this war has gone on. But it's still Putin's goal to subjugate Ukraine if he could. And obviously Russia does have superior military power to the Ukrainians, undoubtedly, and it's also by now more or less cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea. It's really, in effect now, Ukraine is a landlocked country as it stands at the moment. So, of course, the Russians could, in the long run, prevail, but then at what cost, both domestically in Russia and in terms of, future sanctions.
Janice, I do want to pick up on that asymmetrical warfare that you just talked about a moment ago. And to that end, I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, whom you know, to bring up a map of Ukraine right now so we can essentially, for those watching on television, can see the state of play. And for those who are listening on podcast right now, let me just point out Mariupol, which you have heard so much about in recent days in the southeastern part of the country, surrounded by Russian forces. President Zelensky has said it has been reduced to ashes. Janice, I wonder if you could tell us what you think if the Russians were able to completely capture that city, never mind destroy it, but capture and hold it, what that would mean in terms of their war effort.
Well, the reason they have inflicted so much damage on Mariupol, Steve, is because, as you saw on the map, a key goal for Putin is a land bridge for Crimea.
A booster dose implies that you've got your vaccine series, you're done, and then this is, increasing your protection a little bit. And I think that really speaks to people maybe who feel more vulnerable and feel that this is something optional that you do if you maybe think you need a bit more protection. And that's, I think, not the case anymore. With the Omicron variant, you really do need 3 doses to get reasonably good protection against COVID-19. And I think we should really be reframing that fully vaccinated now means actually 3 doses, and that this is a 3-dose vaccine series. And I think that framing might help really get people in the mindset that they haven't finished getting vaccinated, they're not fully vaccinated as the language goes with 2 doses, but they actually need to get the 3 doses.
And Omar, just to build on what Dr. Hirji was just saying, we've had various variants since the vaccines came out. Are the vaccines we are now using still effective against the new mutated variants?
For the original vaccines, they did a great job at fighting off the virus that they were originally designed for. But with high case numbers, there was viral evolution because every replication event is an opportunity for a mutation. And the problem is that the antibodies that we were developing weren't as good at recognizing these mutated spike proteins, which is fine, that happens. But so the ability to recognize it went down a bit. So you do have good protection, you have long-lasting protection. It's just now you're asking your antibodies to see and recognize something that looks a bit different. So in framing it like that, when we boost people, we can bring back up your antibody levels to a high enough level where even if they are slightly less effective, there's more of them. So you can kind of help compensate for that. And that's what we call recall. So we try to induce recall. And otherwise, if you have antibodies that just don't have a good shot at recognizing the new mutated versions, then your immune system would likely try to restart that process and develop brand new antibodies for it instead of using the original ones that are potentially less effective. So this is part of the challenge. And having a booster is a great stopgap while we wait for more updated vaccines to kind of tide us over.
And Matthew, I guess this is where the conversation could lead to what's been done right now, this idea of redesigning the vaccines that we already have. Why might they be more effective if they were to be redesigned?
Well, the situation we're in right now, in many ways, is analogous to the situation that we're used to annually with seasonal influenza. As my colleague just described, over the course of the past 2 years since the pandemic started, the very high global case rates have allowed this virus to evolve and mutate in such a way that it's no longer recognized as well by the immune responses we generated via vaccination. And so one way to improve the quality of that immune response is to update our current vaccines so that they're a closer match to the viruses that are actually causing infections now.
And Don, how would that work? Would we have to go from starting from scratch, or do we need to do full clinical trials as well?
It's a great question. We've learned a lot about protective immune responses to this virus. And so some of that learning we've been able to implement to next generation vaccines. And in fact, my very clever colleague, Matthew, has done some of that work in redesigning an inhaled vaccine that triggers different parts of the immune system, the cellular response as opposed to the antibody response. So in many ways, we have a little bit more knowledge about features that are more resistant to the virus changing and mutating. And by harnessing immune responses to those conserved elements, we may get more or better cross-variant protection. As for whether we need full clinical trials, well, that really depends on whether we understand what we call the immune correlate of protection is. So if we could say your antibodies have to be here to be protected, or you need so many T cells, then we could use that as a proxy measure instead of waiting for people to get naturally infected. Clinical trials take a lot longer if there's less infection circulating and we have to wait for people to be infected. So understanding these immune correlates of protection gives us a stopgap that we can make some inferences about protection without waiting for a really long period of time for people to get naturally infected in the trials.
Let's start with a little background, since as we suggested off the top, I suspect a lot of people have never heard of Len Braithwaite. So here we go, the graphic, please, Sheldon. Leonard Braithwaite was born in Toronto in 1923 to a Barbadian father and Jamaican mother. He served overseas with the Royal Canadian Air Force during World War II. He had a BCom from the University of Toronto in 1950, an MBA from Harvard Business School in 52, his law degree at Osgoode Hall in 58, got elected 2 years later to be a school board trustee, then a town councillor from Etobicoke in 1962, became the MPP for Etobicoke from 63 to 75, and then made a political comeback as controller back in municipal government for the city of Etobicoke from 82 to 85. Now, Michael Coteau, I'm going to start with you first because, frankly, you're the guy who called me a few weeks back and said, here's a guy no one's heard of, and we ought to do a show on this. So you get the first question here, and I'm going to take you back to 2011, when you were one of 12 people of color elected to the Ontario legislature, 12 out of 107. And I wonder what you imagine it would have been like for Len Braithwaite to walk into that legislature in 1963, not 12, but one out of 108. What do you think?
You know, when I used to walk the hallways of Queen's Park and you see these big murals of all these politicians and you see their pictures, and, you know, Mr. Braithwaite always stood out for obvious reasons. There was himself and a woman by the name of Pritchard. She was the only woman, he was the only person of color. And I used to just stop every time I walked by those pictures and looked at his face and thought the same thing, you know, what was life like for him? And I couldn't tell you, you know, because I didn't know him very well, what his life may have been like, but I could imagine. But I always knew walking by there that I had a lot to thank him for really not only breaking the barriers of politics in Ontario, but being the first Black Canadian in this entire country that really just made it possible for someone like me to be elected. And, you know, I'm very grateful for him. And in 2012, I gave a tribute to him in the Ontario legislature. And since that point forward, I've just been researching his life more and more, and really just recognizing his importance in Canadian politics.
Just to be clear, you are drawing a line between his own election in 1963 and your election half a century later. You think you can make that direct connection?
Well, think about it. After him, who was the next person elected, who was Black in Ontario? It was, I think, in 85, it was Alvin Curling.
And 20
and
years
Alvin
later.
Curling, 20 years later, and Alvin Curling is the guy I go to for advice, because there's not many people, who are, Caribbean background, African Canadian, that have walked that pathway. So, Alvin talks about Mr. Braithwaite a lot, and I feel like I have a connection to him, even though it was way back in the early 60s, and I was elected in 2011.
Okay, Gwyn, I gather he was a mentor of yours back in the day. Maybe you could tell us how that happened.
Well, I've always been very interested in service. I grew up in St. Lucia with a father who told us that we have to be our brother's keepers. So, we took that very, very seriously. And at the time, I was looking for people who I feel could inspire the next generation of leaders. And, I was at the time putting on a lot of sessions within the city, schools, churches, City Hall, and Queen's Park. And we were looking for our legends, our icons who've carried us, to this time. We wanted to make sure that we acknowledge them and that we got all the lessons that we could from them. And so, we, at the time, I met Leonard Braithwaite, Lincoln Alexander, the great Dr. Howard McCurdy, who was an incredible mentor of mine as well. And, what I felt my responsibility was to take these people's lives and put them forward so that others can be inspired, they could learn from it and understand the value of civic engagement, of political involvement, of voting. And so this is how I came across this wonderful man.
That's just some of what we covered this week. You can find the full conversations on our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's all for this Friday, March 25th, 2022. Monday on the program, the Federal Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, Mark Miller, explains what he means when he says it's time to give land back to Indigenous peoples. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and Steve will see you on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.